Good evening. This week may well prove to have been the decisive moment in the campaign to decriminalise soft drugs. All sorts of voices now clamour for the legalisation of cannabis in particular. The latest to join in are the Chief Inspector of Prisons and a quartet of cool Conservatives. But the most significant move this week has come from the Home Secretary, David Blunkett, who said he wants an adult, intelligent debate about it. A smoke signal from Westminster that the hard official line on soft drugs was, well, softening. It raises lots of issues about the drug itself. Does cannabis cause cancer and psychoses? Or is it less harmful than tobacco and alcohol? Does it lead those who use it to more vicious and addictive drugs and to crime? If it does, will legalising it make that worse or better? And wider questions that aren't quite so often asked about personal liberty. What right should the state have to interfere in the private behaviour of its adult citizens? Of personal morality. How far is it right to distort the workings of our minds for pleasure? Should we decriminalise cannabis? The adult intelligent debate starts right here on the Marrow Maze, live tonight. Our panel, the constitutional historian Dr. David Starkey, the medical ethicist Dr. David Cook, the journalism professor Ian Hargreaves, and Professor Steve Rose, Director of Brain and Behaviour Research at the Open University. David Starkey, not one of your vices?
No, I escaped for the simple reason, Michael, that whenever I was given hash, it was always with tobacco, and I've never been able to smoke tobacco. The hash I thought was rather wonderful, and I can still remember a drive home. This is a terrible thing to confess. The exquisite quality of red traffic lights. They were quite beautiful. Anyway.
But what's the serious issue here for you?
The beauty of red traffic lights. Pleasure is a very important question. The second is I'm a libertarian. So I think the attempt at the legal ban is preposterous and fundamentally immoral. And thirdly, I'm a historian. We tried prohibition with alcohol in America. It was a catastrophic failure. Our attempt at the prohibition of drugs, which incidentally is inspired by America, is showing exactly the same consequences, and it will end in exactly the same kind of way, and about time too.
The issue for you, David Cook?
Well, I'm interested in medicine, the way that we use drugs in order to alleviate pain or to try and put right something. This week, the British Medical Journal looked at cannabis and said there is little or no medical benefit. Instead, there are adverse effects. That's why we control by legislation soft and hard drugs to limit harm to the self, limit harms to other people. So we have a choice. It's a choice of a society where we're all pleasure-seeking individuals, or a community that protects the young, the vulnerable, and all of us from individual and social harm.
Ian Hargreaves.
Well, if David Cook agrees that this is about altering your mental state for pleasure and that that's immoral, then we better get cracking and ban sex, skiing and opera, as well as drugs. The best argument actually for impeding cannabis use is that it encourages people to smoke tobacco, which kills 120,000 people a year. Compared with that, what these other drugs cause in terms of fatalities is tiny. Ecstasy, single figures, cannabis, virtually none. Morally and practically, we've got this all upside down, and we really do need to change direction.
Stephen Rose, Director of Brain and, Behaviour Research. It's right up your street, isn't it?
Well, yes, and surprisingly, I find myself at one with David Starkey, even down to the joy of the red traffic lights. I do think the present situation
is absurd. At least it was red, not green.
The green didn't look bad too, I seem to recall. The present situation is absurd, though. Some drugs that affect mind and brain are readily and legally available, like alcohol and nicotine. Others are legally available on prescription, and some we even oblige people to take, children, to have to take Ritalin, for example. And still others are legal, and illegal, but equally readily available, cannabis, ecstasy or cocaine. There's clearly no health or moral reason why some fall into one category rather than another. It's a matter of historical accident. Addiction is a highly flexible concept. Time, therefore, to legalise the lot and let the drug barons fight it out with the tobacco mafia and the distillers.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Maybe the moral maze might be mind-changing. Let's see. Our first witness is Tessa Corner, who's a former heroin addict, now works in drug rehabilitation as Director of Development, charity called Street Scene in Bournemouth, and she's on the line from Bournemouth now. Tessa, when did you start using cannabis yourself?
I started using cannabis at the age of 14.
You ended up as a heroin addict, didn't you, living in pretty squalid circumstances in a squat, and in a very bad way.
Yeah.
For you at least, did you think that cannabis led directly to that situation?
Yes, for me it was always looking for a bigger buzz and a higher feeling. So really anything could have led on to it, but certainly for me, cannabis was a gateway drug.
And on the basis of your personal experience and on the work you do with other drug addicts, do you think that soft drugs should be legalised?
I don't actually think there's really enough work been done on it. I mean, I can hear what the gentlemen are saying in the background there, but I think we really need to investigate, as someone said about alcohol being a legal drug in this country and causing a lot of deaths and people who are drink driving. I was quite concerned actually by people being very into red traffic lights. I'm glad nobody was crossing the road.
Right.
I stopped to admire them. I stopped to admire them.
Yes, all right. We've had
but
enough
it's
of the
still
red traffic lights
dangerous.
for the moment.
It's still quite a dangerous thing to do for other people.
Indeed. So you sound as if you're sitting on the fence on it, Tessa.
I think really we need
pressed,
to investigate.
do you think it should be decriminalised or not?
I think decriminalisation is not a bad thing because a lot of people fall foul of the law, youngsters particularly, for no reason other than experimentation. And I think that's a great shame that they can't then, go to America and stuff like this because of experimentation when they're young. So I'm not against decriminalisation, but as far as legalisation is concerned, I really think we need to do some more work.
OK. Ian Hargreaves, your witness.
What is it, do you think, that made you, along with a number of other people, but a minority, get involved in addictive drugs?
I wasn't happy with what I thought life had to offer. I didn't particularly look forward to my life with any great relish, and therefore decided the best option was to be out of my head. And it's really quite as simple as that.
Do you think, though, that there was some kind of predisposition, therefore, in you, a vulnerability? If you like?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And now that you work with other drug users, do you has that thesis stood up? The thing that you observed about yourself, do you now observe it in others?
Yes, I do. I do agree that people with addiction problems do seem to have a propensity to go in this direction, as do people with alcohol problems.
Do you have any sense, I mean, I don't mean a precise mathematical one, but a rough sense of how many of us that accounts for? I mean, is it 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, or...?
I think actually it's generally reckoned, and I can't remember where I got this from, to be about 1 in 10 people have a problem with addiction. Not necessarily alcohol or drugs, because you can be addicted to a huge number of things. But about 1 in 10 people seem to have a disposition for an addiction of some sort or another.
Okay, so you'd agree that the propensity to have an addiction for drugs is a minority of a minority. It's quite a small proportion of the population.
Absolutely, but surely if we legalise it, then that actually makes it more widely available for that to become a much larger minority.
Well, let's just look at the logic of that. I mean, if we agree that we are dealing with a problem which affects or afflicts a minority of a minority, does it really make sense for the primary response of the state to that to be a ban on a huge range of substances affecting all people on the same terms? Wouldn't it be better to target our approach to this in some way that responds to the evidence a bit more?
I think also, although we're talking about a minority of a minority, we are also talking about people that they directly affect. Family, friends, and with the car thing, for example, when you're talking about the number of people that are killed by drunk drivers, I mean, that has a huge effect not only on the person who's killed by a drunk driver, but those who, their family and loved ones. It does actually affect a much wider group than just the people who have addiction problems themselves.
Of course it does, but even to take that example, I mean, leaving aside the celebration of undergraduate life that we had about going through traffic lights at red, if that's what we were being told, the specific problem of preventing people or restricting them from driving when not in a fit state to drive. Again, we don't deal with that by banning alcohol or even banning the kind of prescription drugs which cause haziness. We warn people, we educate, and indeed we have laws which, if you are caught doing that, you are quite properly punished. Isn't that the right way to go about it?
I don't disagree with that at all.
So how does that connect to the case for these very sweeping prohibitions on whole categories of drugs?
I'm not necessarily saying that we should have sweeping prohibitions. What I'm saying is we should do an awful lot more work to find out actual percentages, because there is no real evidence one way or the other. There's an awful lot of statistics that are half-baked, for want of a better expression, that can be read one way or the other.
Well, it's true that we can always use better data, but isn't it, I mean, won't you at least agree with me that we do need to change direction here? I'm not suggesting we should alter all these laws overnight, but haven't we got to the point where we can see that the current route is not getting us anywhere?
I do actually agree with you on that. I do also think that we need to start educating children as to the nature of life in schools. I think this whole thing with drugs is dealt with much too late.
We are talking largely theoretically about all this. You actually see the misery that drugs cause.
Yes.
Do you think the debate is being carried on in a rational sort of way, or do you think we're missing something about the relationship, for instance, between drugs and crime?
The thing with the relationship between drugs and crime, everyone talks about drugs and crime, and I know that it is a huge problem. I don't think actually legalising it or decriminalising it will necessarily reduce the crime in necessarily as straight a line as we seem to think.
Why?
Because a lot of the crimes are not solely to do with getting drugs. It's not solely... The burglaries and robberies are, but then there's also violent crimes and all sorts of other stuff that goes on, which won't go away just because drugs are decriminalised or legalised. Also, we're then shifting the problem from the legal system to the health system.
I understand. Stephen Rose.
Tessa, what you're saying is that you started using cannabis and then went on to heroin, even though both were illegal.
Yes.
So the fact that they were illegal didn't stop you getting them.
Not at all. It would have made no difference to me whatsoever.
In which case, why make them illegal?
Well, they are already illegal. We're actually talking about it the other way around.
Well, sure, but I mean, the argument here is whether, in fact, they should be legal or whether they should not. So what is the argument for keeping them illegal, then, if, in fact, their being illegal didn't stop you getting them?
Strange enough, I'm not actually arguing against it. What I'm actually saying is we need to make more detailed studies into what would happen with all the different options that we have available to us, as opposed to not doing any studies and taking it from a sort of, well, it's like this because it's historical, or it's like this because we're following America. We need to look at what will actually happen, get some idea of what will actually happen.
And how are we going to do that
How
are we going to do that without trying it?
Well, by trying it in smaller stages than legalising everything.
Okay, but I mean, so there you were as a heroin addict by 18. There you were. You've said living in a squat, presumably at least partly because you actually sort of needed the money for it. Supposing, in fact, you could have got your heroin on prescription, would you still have been living in the squat, or would you have been able to use your heroin in a different sort of way?
The thing with addiction, though, is that you seem to think that if they gave me a certain amount of heroin each day, that would keep me happy for the rest of my life. It doesn't actually work like that, because with addiction, the amount that you need to be as stoned as you want to be increases relatively rapidly. So the prescription would need to be increasing at the same kind of pace. It's not that you could give me one amount and I would have been happy. Furthermore, I was actually as miserable as sin, as are most alcoholics who can quite legitimately buy their drug of choice. In Sainsbury's even, they're still not happy. Addiction doesn't make people happy. Just giving them their drugs is not necessarily the solution to the problem.
David Starkey, last question.
Tessa, why did you decide to stop?
I actually fell pregnant, and I knew that I had a right, in some senses, to destroy my own body, which is what I was doing. I was killing myself slowly and quite knowingly, but I didn't have the right to do it to my daughter.
Can I just stop you there? In other words, it's nothing to do with the law. It's nothing to do with legal systems. It's to do with actually having something and somebody to live for. Wholly personal. Wholly personal.
That person that people generally want to live for is quite often themselves.
No bad thing?
No, absolutely not. But I think that's what I was saying about the education. We need to be educating people as to the nature of life, what it is to be a human being, how you feel, how you deal with your feelings, the options that are really available to you. These are the things that I lacked when I picked up drugs.
Tessa, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Our next witness is Mike Jay. He's written a number of books about drugs, including Emperors of Dreams, drugs in the 19th century, where drugs like cocaine and opium were freely available. Mike, you quite like to go back to that situation?
Well, it's interesting. It's a very different situation from what we have now. These drugs were, as you say, freely available. Gradually they tended to be supplied through chemists rather than through...
And in various forms, tonics and all that sort of stuff.
Well, that's what's interesting, is that, I mean, if we take...
Collis's mixture, I believe.
That's right, yeah. If we take cocaine, for an example. One could go into a chemist shop, 100 years ago and simply buy cocaine, or indeed heroin, which had just been launched 100 years ago as an over-the-counter cough medicine by Bayer Pharmaceuticals. So one could buy pure cocaine and indeed hypodermic syringes and all these kinds of things. But actually, given the choice, the form in which most people chose to consume a drug like cocaine was in a sort of mild and manageable preparation, a tonic or a lozenge, Coca-Cola famously, and all kinds of other things. Of course, what happened once cocaine was prohibited was that this mild and manageable form, which was actually the form which most people gravitated towards, became the one thing that one could no longer get, because the supply was entirely controlled by a black market who were only interested in making the substance available in the most powerful, most concentrated, most dangerous and most profitable form.
David Cork, your witness.
I'm interested in this week's BMJ and in the Lancet of the end of '98, which looked at the medical effects of drugs, both soft and hard. Yes, it gave euphoria, but it also altered perception. There was loss of short-term memory, attention span, motor skills. It was likely, and they said very likely, to be carcinogenic, to cause chronic bronchitis, and to affect sex. You think this is a good recipe for us to embrace and to do this?
I don't think there's any doubt that all these drugs that we're talking about, from cannabis to heroin, which are all very potent things, are potentially beneficial and also potentially dangerous. And in fact, I think the fact that they're dangerous is perhaps the strongest argument for legalising them. Given that they're dangerous, which they are, would we rather that they were supplied by a black market or controlled and regulated?
But it seems to me that you're then suggesting, well, if the law is being broken, then let's change the law. But we could do the same with speed limits, we could do it with petty thieving, we could do it with tax evasion. Is that a good enough reason to change the law?
I think if you look at the reasons why the law came into play in the first place, there were sort of health and medical components.
It was to protect against harm, presumably.
Well, a lot of it was based on... there was very strong consensus among doctors at the time that by far the most dangerous substance, the most problematic substance for society was alcohol. And the reason that the substances we're talking about were criminalised, by and large, is because they were used largely at that time by what we would now call ethnic minorities.
And that's why we criminalise the use of alcohol and the buying of alcohol among young people, to try and protect them.
That's right, and I think age restrictions are perfectly sensible.
So isn't legislation important then?
I think, as I was saying, the reason that we, at the time that these drugs were criminalised, all kinds of systems were put in place of
we're talking about the reality
and
now.
Sales by chemists, and sales by chemists and licensed premises, and there's a large number of possible frameworks for these drugs to be slotted into. The reason they weren't slotted into this framework was because they were seen at the time as
but the evidence now shows there is harm, and the harm is so great that even for medical purposes, doctors are saying we ought not to be prescribing this.
There are certainly risks. It's very important to be informed about the risks.
These are facts.
Tobacco, alcohol.
Oh, well, quite, but that's a different kind of point. If we're
It's
going to
not
talk
a
about other
different
drugs.
point.
Well,
Exactly
the point that the comparison I'd make is the comparison I'm sure we've heard a lot, because it's been trotted out a lot recently, which is that statistically the risk of dying from taking ecstasy is comparable, very similar in fact, to the risk of dying from horse riding. What we don't prohibit horse riding. What we do is make sure people wear hard hats and are taught to ride horses properly. And another statistic, which I think we should bear in mind and on the subject, is that we're 30 times more likely to die in police custody than we are from taking ecstasy. I think that really raises the question of who's protecting whom from
right,
what.
But somebody who takes cannabis is 60 times more likely to develop cancer than somebody who doesn't.
No, go. No.
In response to that, my response again would be that we need to look at these risks and place them in a broader context of risks that we take all the time.
Can I just ask one other question from the last speaker, Tess, who talked about the way that she sought for ever greater thrills, ever more pleasure. How are you going to prevent that progression from the use of allegedly a soft drug to what we call hard drugs, in the search for greater pleasure?
I think we have that progression now. If we look at the number of people who are taking drugs, there are obviously a majority of people in the country who aren't very interested in taking drugs and wouldn't take them whether they were legal or illegal. There are also a large number of people who don't take them for health reasons because
so you don't think the law plays any
made.
role in terms of protecting and encouraging people to say no to peer group pressure and so on?
I'm not sure I've ever met anyone who really wanted to try drugs but didn't for the single reason it was against the law. I'd be interested to know if you've met anyone.
Is the protection of vulnerable members of our society a potent argument for maintaining the law against these kind of drugs, do you think?
It's a potent argument for taking out the millions and millions of pounds that we spend on enforcement and putting it into information, education and treatment.
Ian Hargreaves.
We've heard a bit about driving under the influence of drugs. I mean, what do you think about that argument, that we will be exposing ourselves to more bad driving because there will be more, perhaps relatively moderate, but still driving impairing behaviour around by doing this?
Well, I think the answer is in the question, in the sense that what we're worried about is impairment. And what's odd and virtually unique about alcohol is, as a volatile substance, you can do a test of it, see how much is in the bloodstream and correlate that with intoxication. That isn't the same with these other drugs that we're talking about. A drug like cannabis can stay in the system for up to a month and so on. What we're really concerned about is people driving while impaired. That's the problem.
How would we control that in practice, since we would clearly want to control it because some people are irresponsible and would do it?
I think that's a pragmatic question. If you step in too soon, it's draconian and unenforceable. If you step in too late, I mean, this is a call that basically has to be made by police forces, and I think it's solvable.
David Starkey?
Mike, I'd like just to investigate a little bit more the question of the historical background of the Prohibition. You've mentioned one of the components, which was gross racism. It was also very much linked, wasn't it, to, as I remember, to eugenics, to the idea of a new, pure,
Absolutely.
Clean society.
It was very much linked to, we say ethnic minorities now, the term that was used at the time, by most
inferior
doctors.
Races.
Inferior races, exactly. And these were the degenerate habits of inferior races, and the idea was that substances like opium and cannabis, if one took them, one might pass on what we would now call genetic defects to one's offspring and so on. Furthermore, that it was an extremely bad idea for different races to mix and produce children. Miscegenation was the word. And this was, it's very easy to see, particularly with things like the early opium prohibitions in Chinatown, that this is the actual fear. The actual fear is that men and women of different races.
So not only
together.
would most of us now regard this as obscene as social policy, it's indecently bad science.
Yes.
It's indecently bad science. And isn't it interesting that the only country that has seriously retained this kind of full approach in Europe is Sweden? Where Sweden, of course, was the country that actually maintained eugenic policies
until the 70s, yeah.
Until the 70s, like effectively stopping the mentally deficient breeding. So don't you think those, like my dear Christian on the right, who advocate the maintenance of these things, should actually look at the world they're coming from and hang their heads in shame?
Thank you. Let me break up the coziness of this little dialogue. David Cook.
I'm interested not so much in Sweden, but in the United States, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where they have some of the strictest control flags. Now, of drugs? How do you explain that then?
I think it was America who tried to lead the rest of the world into alcohol prohibition. When that failed, it was extremely important to America for various reasons to show that prohibition hadn't been an aberration, and it was
so
America
nothing to do with stopping harm for individuals or stopping harm for the community?
It was really no, and in the sense that these drug laws were really assembled by American initiatives, through the UN Hague conferences, Geneva Conventions,
Mike,
and
why
so on.
didn't you say that it's just because America's got more religious loons than the rest of the world?
Stephen Rose.
Presumably people are taking drugs of this sort either because it improves their health or diminishes pain or gives them pleasure. Is there a reason why they shouldn't?
I think we've had all kinds of attempts to explain why people take these drugs. Historically, we were first of all told that they were addicted to them, they were enslaved, they had no choice, and so on. I think it's now become clear that it's only very tiny minority of drug users who are clinically addicted to the drugs they're using. Then we got peer pressure as the next explanation. People didn't actually want to take these drugs, but they were unable to resist the social pressures around them. And then we had a study done at Exeter University about 5 years ago, which demonstrated that actually teenage drug users have on average slightly higher self-esteem than the average, so they would be less susceptible to peer pressure. I think,
can I just short-circuit this?
I was just about to get there, actually.
No, all right.
The group there is so interesting.
We could see where you were getting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think on this wider issue that, we all, most of us either drink or do something, but do you think basically it's a good idea for us to actually monkey around with our minds and distort our perception of the world around us in that way? Do you think that's a thing that we should be, generally encouraging?
I think the reason that people take these drugs is the reason that they've been taken throughout history and across all cultures, which is that they're pleasurable, and the reason that people continue to take them is because they judge the pleasures to outweigh the risks. And in terms of whether we should encourage this or not, there's an awful lot of talk about sending the right message, and I think we've been sending the same message for an awfully long time now. It doesn't seem to have had any effect, and I think maybe listening to messages is perhaps a little more important at this point.
Okay. Mike J., thanks very much indeed. Our last witness is John Strang, who's got the glorious title of Professor of the Addictions at the National Addiction Centre, which I think is based in the University of London and the Maudsley Hospital. John, you see this as both a clinician and an academic, and I gather for you these, it's a rather finely balanced argument one way or another. But if it was actually up to you, and I was really pushing you, would you decriminalise soft drugs?
Mm-mm. I think what we're very much wanting to look at is how much small incremental change one way or the other might lead to a better or worse situation. So if we have a situation where we accept the responsibility to exercise some degree of control, then what would happen if we reduced the illegality of cannabis, for example? Or what would happen if we reduced or increased the illegality of heroin? I think it's a real mistake.
What would happen in your view?
Well, we've got plenty of evidence with alcohol and tobacco, which are very useful reference points for what happens if you increase or decrease price or increase or decrease sales outlets. And consumption is far more elastic than we thought. That in all of my career, I won't have anything like as much influence as Gordon Brown does on the number of people who drink or smoke and the harms they get from that. So by reducing the illegality of the drugs, I'd predict that the amounts of use went up proportionately.
More people would use more of it, more often.
Yes, and one would then need to look at what the exact ratio was. Was it more people using the same amounts? Yeah. But there would be more used.
So on that basis, you would be more inclined to keep it illegal than to decriminalise it. I know these terms are not quite exactly the same.
Yes, I think there's much about the present situation that is working better than people credit it with.
Stephen Rose.
But would it matter if more was used?
I think that's where I come in from my particular standpoint as a doctor or with an interest in sort of public health policy. The more that is used, the more harms will be accrued by society. Now, whether that's something that I believe we should collectively accept responsibility for and try to shape, but that I'm fairly satisfied in my mind from the evidence is clearly what the result would be.
But we're living in a world where there's a tremendous amount of harm done by the criminalisation in terms both of the prices, in terms of the mafias, in terms of the murders, and what it is, 35% or so of people in British prisons are actually there for drug-related crimes, mainly to get money to fix their habits.
Yes, it's where I think the way you moulded your argument would be different depending which drug you were looking at in this debate. I think there are features of the extreme of prohibition which are clearly counterproductive to society's well-being and the individuals in that society. For example, with cannabis use, I would have thought that the imprisonment of people for personal use of cannabis was clearly a disproportionate response in maintaining its illegality.
Why is there a fundamental difference between this and alcohol and tobacco then?
Well, alcohol and tobacco
have to come into this debate at some point. But what's difficult about it, of course, is they're often put up as being excellent examples of a good working relationship. And it has to be acknowledged that whilst if you have a war on drugs, there are peacetime drugs, aren't they? And in terms of a peacetime relationship with drugs, they're pretty bad role models. 120,000 deaths per year from tobacco in this country, 30,000 deaths per year. It's not exactly a shining example of what you'd seek to replicate with others.
I don't know if you heard the top end of the programme, but there was a moment of true confession there. As Professor of Addictions, which of these various addictive agents are you familiar with from your own personal use?
It's an interesting question for you to ask, and personally, I think it's none of your business. I think what is important for someone in my position is to have a clear understanding of what drug use means for individuals. I think my own personal use isn't directly relevant.
Okay, let me try it another way then, because we heard the first witness talking about her belief there was something called an addictive personality. In fact, Ian Hargreaves suggested that as well. Do you believe there is an addictive personality in this sense?
I was interested in listening to her description of it because it's a very popular view in the treatment field itself and also with the general public. There are clearly vulnerability factors amongst those. Amongst those are genetic vulnerabilities or your upbringing and your immediate environment. They don't adequately explain the variability of the phenomenon in society. So, yes, there are vulnerability factors, but there's something dangerously intoxicating about the view that only the vulnerable will ever develop problems. The reality is that as the extent of use in society increases, then the proportion who get into difficulties also increases.
Then one last question. Why do you think that the number of people using heroin and these drugs has increased so dramatically over the last couple of decades?
It's increased over all sorts of different countries and different contexts. I'd actually turn it around the other way. It remains extremely low compared with our peacetime drugs. It's a relative success story despite the fact that it's sharply increasing and we're worried about it. But less than 1% having used heroin is not exactly the sort of failure that we have with alcohol or tobacco.
Ian Hargreaves?
But if there is a set of propensities, however you define them differently from Tessa Corner, shouldn't it follow that, as it were, no matter how many different ways there are to satisfy this propensity to addictive behaviour, there is a limit to it? I mean, is that a correct statement in your view?
Yeah, I think you're in danger of grabbing this addictive personality or addictive propensity too much. The main factor that shapes the likelihood of an adolescent today using is the decade in which they're going through their adolescence or the city in which they're going through their adolescence. That isn't... you could call that a propensity.
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly you're right.
But it's one over which we have
cultural
influence.
factors and availability affect it.
Tenfold to 100-fold. I mean, this
who could
is
disagree
the
with
sort
that?
of
No,
difference that's pretty massive.
That's clearly correct. But what I'm asking is, in a way, a variation of Stephen Rose's question, which is, are we going to, by making a few drugs more easily available than they are currently available, going to increase the amount of addictive behaviour in society?
In all probability, we will be increasing the cumulative total. There's, again, it at first glance looks attractive to think there's like a hydraulic view that if you push down on this drug, the other one pops up. On the whole, it's a much more direct relationship with availability. It's closer to cornflakes or Levi's.
Okay, but what you said when you were talking about the hard politics of this, that Gordon Brown will have more effect than you and any of your colleagues working in the treatment field, suggests that actually you think the market relationships here are critical, the critical determinant. Isn't that what we've learned? And by placing one set of activities wholly in the black market, we remove any ability to exercise influence, let alone control.
And the tax gain to the government.
Yeah, well, sticking with the main question and leaving the tax gains, which would clearly be way outside my area, I think what is uncomfortable about trying to mould it in its illegality is that it doesn't feel very tidy. and people are always wanting to tidy the situation up. But the fact is, we do have an influence on availability and price, and we have, for example, the choice to make about the relative investment we make against cannabis versus heroin, for example. Those are very important debates that should exist. What proportion of our effort should be against the different drugs? What proportion of our response should be in the prevention field, or the law enforcement field, or the treatment field? I think we've got it wrong at the moment, but that's within its illegal status.
David Starkey?
Professor Strang, as you're convinced that prohibition has been such a triumphant success against heroin and that tobacco and alcohol are so harmful, why aren't you mounting a campaign to reintroduce prohibition of tobacco and alcohol?
Great danger about speaking in a setting such as this is people will reconstruct your views in a way which are different from what you actually said. I'm not a great champion of prohibition.
Really?
I happen to think that the illegal status of some of these drugs contributes to individuals' decisions not to use them, and part of what I think is far more interesting to do is to look at how can you, just as the law may be an ass, but it can sometimes be quite a subtle ass in terms of the way it's applied. Are there ways in which we can exercise our influences at a societal level to reduce the amount of use, to reduce the amount of harm?
David Cook?
If we were starting from a blank sheet and we knew the effects of cigarette smoking and alcohol, then perhaps we would indeed legislate against them. But I'm interested in this argument because there are known harms from these things. Let's add to it by introducing drugs which we know there are harms for. How do you respond to that?
No, I think that's a very correct point of view to have. The fact that we may have a relationship which collectively in society we pay a large price for our peacetime relationship with drugs and tobacco and alcohol, it doesn't logically follow that you seek to reproduce that relationship with other drugs. I'd agree with that point.
Professor Strang, thank you very much indeed. Can we draw some of these threads together? David Starkey, the libertarian position presumably would be that what people get up to in their own sort of private behaviour is really no business of the government's. But I think the contrary argument that's been advanced is that when it comes to drugs, the consequences do reach other people one way or the other. Is that not an argument that weighs with you?
Not at all, because it seems to me when they reach other people, we already have other legal means for dealing with it. In other words, as Ian has correctly pointed out, if you drive under the influence of drink or drugs, you are correctly prosecuted. If you neglect your children, you are, for whatever reason, you are correctly prosecuted. The whole point, it seems to me, is the actual use of these things is demonstrably, if it's harmful at all, only harmful per se to the individual. There may be social consequences, but they should be addressed in entirely distinct fashions. Full stop. Period. And I was very interested that Professor Strang, whom we have to remember is essentially a pathologist of drugs, he looks at the catastrophes, he looks at those who've suffered, he looks at the problems. Of course he's in favour of banning. I was very interested at the extraordinary logical weaknesses of his position. He began by putting forward a series of arguments that naturally point to prohibition, and the moment he was actually put on the back foot over it, he backed off. That did not impress me.
But don't you think it's a sensible and rational, that's the way it struck me, even if I may or may not agree with him, to sort of say if the consequence of legalising these drugs is that the sum total of human misery rises, then that is at least a powerful argument one with the other.
But he couldn't specify for one moment what the sum total was, except in terms of other issues. Well, no, except in terms of other issues like driving, like, as it were, all those other ills that David referred to, which are indeed pathologies. I think we need to ask and understand the question of why drug use has increased really quite dramatically over the last decades in Britain and in other countries. And if that is saying something about the social context in which it's increased, then I think that's the issue that ought to be addressed. And David Cook has gone on about the harms, but again, it's not quite clear what those harms are, except those which are held in other sorts of ways.
It was quite clear what the harms were, because we heard from Tessa Corner exactly what the harms can be for some people.
We don't know if she would have been miserable without the drug being taken, and we don't know the extent to which the drug alleviates usual.
We also know quite clearly that there are
David Cook.
harms which the medical community across the board are recognising and dangers they're warning us about. If we're asking...
So they're eating red meat.
Well, that's right, and that's why when there is a problem and we know the problem, we try to control it. That's the role of the law. It's to protect us.
It can be
And
the
that's why
role
it's
of
important.
advice and education. It doesn't have to be the role of the law.
Also,
Ian
I
Hargreaves?
mean, the problem is with your argument, David, that the pragmatics of this are not proven on your side of the argument. It's not at all clear that more harm in total would result. So when you are faced with the choice of uncertainty about whether the harm goes up or the harm goes down, and even
there's
Professor
certainly
Strang
harms.
said he thought we'd control it better if the Chancellor was able to tax it, you have then to weigh against that, the very great incursion into the moral principle that we should be allowed to do that which only harms the individual with freedom if it is only harming
But even
the
those who've
individual.
argued in favour of decriminalising have all agreed that there are certain risks. When we were presented with Mike J, he was clear that there are risks. The problem is whether or not the addict is in any kind of state to make some kind of judgment about risk. Well, that's taken to the extreme. The question is, as Tessa said, when it looks at education, the question is whether our children ought to be exposed to a society where drugs are freely available and it makes no difference.
But aren't you-
They are already.
Sorry,
They are
David.
already.
They
David
are
Starkey.
indeed already. But why this argument, for the sake of the children, is one of the most deadly thin ends of the wedge around at the moment? It would ban almost every adult activity. And to go back to your point, Stephen, why is drug taking more prevalent? Because pleasure is more prevalent.
Exactly.
Because we're a society that has got more money, more time, and wants to enjoy
and
itself.
what of the pleasure?
Because religion failed to satisfy.
That is not. That is not.
Hang on,
that-
David Cook.
The basic
first, and
problem
then
is that it is pleasure, but it's also an escapism. It's an escapism from reality.
What's wrong with that?
Well, the question is whether or not it actually helps us cope, either as individuals, and when there is direct harm to the individual as well as harm to society in the long term through the NHS, through taxation, there will be harms.
Well, I
Ian
must say,
Hargreaves.
when the argument swung round to comparing the consumption of ecstasy and the consumption of horse riding, I couldn't help thinking that my
But only in one particular
daughter's
respect.
hedonistic appetite for riding horses is not only as dangerous, it's a good deal more expensive than taking ecstasy.
Are you about to recommend that she changes her form of stimulation?
The only point which I disagree with David, he says there's more money for pleasure. There's also a good deal more misery and despair, and it may very well be that penny
You're
drunk,
capable of
tuppence
measuring
dead
these
drunk
things, are you,
is-
Steve?
We know that there's a good
Sorry,
deal of unemployment. We know
partially
there's
what
a
you were
good
saying
deal
earlier
of immiseration. We know that there's an increasing gulf between rich and poor in society, and we know that penny drunk, tuppence dead drunk is the cheapest way out of Manchester in the 19th century, and it may well be the best way for people these days in the sink areas of our cities.
So you regard that as desirable, escapism as a
No,
desirable
I don't
thing?
regard it as desirable, but I regard it as understandable, not to be handled by legislation, but to be handled by
Yes.
altering the scope of
and
society.
also when you have a situation where a very substantial proportion of the prison population is out of its head on drugs, you cannot avoid noticing the link between the legal approach to drugs and issues of social control.
A last word, if it is only one word, David.
Well, that's not an argument for changing the law. If we're going to change the law, there has to be evidence of a severe problem and that the cure will be better in the end. It's unproven.
OK, that's it for this week. From our panel, David Cook, David Starkey, Ian Hargreaves and Stephen Rose. And from me until next week, there, puff, and we've gone. Goodbye.